HarmonicDyne is not exactly a brand that many people will be familiar with, perhaps because it seems that this Helios headphone is their first product. So, is this brand something that more people ought to be aware of, or is it destined to remain in obscurity? Well, let's check out the Helios and find out. When looking at the Helios, things can seem pretty impressive given the combination of materials used such as plastic, metal, and even wood. This is a combination which we normally only see on considerably more expensive headphones. The design does perhaps look pretty decent, but it's when we take a closer look that we'll notice a few shortcomings. If you want a bit more detail about this, then I'll leave a link in the description for the full written review. For the sake of keeping this video short and sweet, I'll only cover the basics, otherwise I'll just be droning on about it. Basically, all you need to know is that whilst the Helios looks interesting and is pretty comfortable, the build quality is where it starts to show that it's a more budget-friendly headphone. The metal parts are fairly thin pieces which are then filled in with plastic on the underside, and likewise the wood inlay also seems like it might only be a thin piece, and the gaps between the inlay and the metal is very uneven. The wood portion of the ear cup is much better, but there are still areas here and there where it doesn't sit flush with the metal portion, and the headphone connector sockets protrude at different lengths. So really it's just a recurring theme of questionable quality control. Overall, whilst it might look more premium than what the price tag might suggest, the build quality is really not much better than an all-plastic headphone such as the HD58X. As for the sound, what we have here is what seems to be a fairly typical kind of response for an open back pair of headphones which uses a dynamic driver. There's the usual roll-off in the sub-bass and a bass hump which peaks at around 160 Hz, followed by a gradual dip towards 1.5 kHz, after which the trend is for the response to rise throughout the overall treble region. So, this gives a pretty mild V-shaped signature, or perhaps it's more of a U-shaped signature. However, it's when I start listening to the Helios that I realized it doesn't quite sound the way I had expected it to. I've listened to a number of mild V-shaped signatures before, but the Helios had a very specific characteristic that I can't really say I've picked up on with many other headphones. Unfortunately, that specific characteristic was not a pleasant one. The bass sounds reasonably good and it's pretty punchy, but that lack in sub-bass extension does come across rather clearly. This is something that I can live with, but what I can't live with is how the mids and treble are presented. I don't know exactly which part of the signature is responsible for this, but vocals have this really odd nasal kind of sound to them. It's as though they lack the presence which would normally make them sound natural and engaging. Likewise, when we move over into the treble, it just doesn't sound natural. Actually, come to think of it, the best way I can think of to describe the treble is to say that it sounds somewhat metallic. It does a pretty good job at extracting details, but they just don't sound natural to me. They come across forced and artificial, and at times it does cross over well into the sibilance territory. Don't get me wrong, I certainly have heard considerably worse, but I am still disappointed with the signature nonetheless. The thing is, if we focus on the fact that the Helios costs just $129, then we could perhaps say that it sounds acceptable, or perhaps even reasonably decent for the money. However, I think that would only really have been a valid thing to say a few years ago. You see, the problem is that we are now at a point where the $100 to $200 price bracket has become immensely competitive due to products such as the HE4XX and the HE35X collaborations between Drop and Hi-Fi-Man, as well as, of course, the HD58X. Unfortunately, I have not tried either of those Hi-Fi-Man models, so we'll just have to make do with my slightly modified HD58X for this comparison. A link for the specific modification will be in the description. Comparing the response graphs between the Helios and my 58X, we can see that the Helios has a bit more of a V-shaped signature, although the treble seems to look more even despite having a greater number of peaks. But simply looking at these graphs really didn't give me much of an indication of what the differences would be. In fact, the response of the Helios seems more balanced and perhaps neutral when we look at the level of the treble region in relation to the bass and the mid regions. Unfortunately, in reality, the HD58X sounds considerably more natural than what the Helios does. When I swap back and forth between them, the nasal tonality to vocals and the metallic sounding treble just becomes so apparent compared to the seemingly more refined character of the HD58X. In that respect, the 58X just sounds more correct to me than what the Helios does. So really, I'm having a ridiculously hard time trying to find something about the sound signature of the Helios that I really like. I suppose the closest I can get to complimenting it is to say that the actual speed of the driver almost makes it sound a bit like a planar magnetic driver. But other than that, I really cannot see any advantages in the signature of the Helios over that of something like the HD5-8X. So I guess you can already see where my thoughts are going in terms of the kind of value that the Helios brings to the table. Yes, the 5.8x does cost a bit more than what the Helios does, and whilst there are a ton of examples where paying more doesn't necessarily get you more, in this case spending a bit more definitely goes a long way. I've also not really had the chance to check out many other headphones in this specific price region, so as much as I'd like to recommend and refer you to some other products, the 5.8x is the closest thing I have. The fact is, to some extent, the Helios just feels a bit more like a concept or prototype rather than a finished product. And I say this specifically because I find there to be a disparity between what the Helios is advertised to be and what it is in reality. Some of the taglines used include references to how the Helios is tuned to sound like a studio and how it has all kinds of wonderful detail and balance. Well, sorry, but I just don't find any of those claims to be true. As I said, the Helios feels more like a prototype, and the potential is definitely there for it to be a really good product, but it requires a significant amount of refinement in all areas. I suppose if you like a V-shaped signature with more emphasis on the treble, then perhaps you'd like the Helios. But speaking strictly from an audio quality perspective, it just doesn't cut it for me, and so I just can't find it in me to recommend it. Well, as Jeremy Clarkson would say, on that terrible disappointment, it's time to end the show. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed it, hit that like button. If you disliked it, hit that dislike button twice. That's all from me for now, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.